timeline presentation of the collection. And we have on view here, so the timeline is set up here in the museum for those of you that haven't been to the museum before. It's set up to start at around 1700, and every gallery you go to is another 20, 30 years up the road. So quite a few galleries in, we end up at the time of the American Revolution. So you're looking at the 1770s, 1780s, and the work in here, the furnishings that you find in this room really go up until, you know, the early 1800s. But the painting collection, we've elected to keep most of the Peale family paintings together in one space, and they actually span from about 1780 up to about 1865 or so. So really from the War of Independence to the Civil War period, because there were so many different members of the Peale family. So who are the Peale families? You're looking at a very large family that was, but the progenitor of this family, the sort of centerpiece of this family, was a guy named Charles Willson Peale. Charles Willson Peale was from, he grew up in Annapolis, Maryland. He was in the, I would have to say probably in the 1750s, 1760s, apprenticed as a saddle maker in Annapolis. And he ended up opening up his own saddle shop. Although, by all accounts, it seems like he wasn't that interested in leather work. So he tried doing this for a little while. The business that he created to become a saddler wasn't very successful, but in not too distantly afterwards, he started to go into painting. And he had a real proclivity for painting. And then he ended up studying with a couple of individuals like John Hyselius and Copley before one of his earliest patrons sent him to study with a guy named Benjamin West in London, an American who had moved to London and became remarkably talented, or was a remarkably talented painter, but became really, really fashionable in London. And one of the first Americans, American-born individuals to become that fashionable in London. And so Charles Willson Peale went to study with him, and it was there that he really started to develop his most mature style. Now, when you come to the museum, we do have one work by Charles Willson Peale that's a little bit earlier in our presentation of the work of the Peale family. And I brought it off of its position in the timeline here into this Federal Gallery to sort of show you like what his artistic origins were like. This is a relatively new object to the museum. It's a portrait of a woman named Mary Wincoop Ridgely, and she lived literally just around the corner here in downtown Dover. As a matter of fact, this piece had never been out of the family's hands in that ancestral home, the Ridgely house in Dover, until it came here about a year and a half ago. This is a remarkable, wonderful, wonderful painting. I talk about it a lot in these programs. So I'm sorry if I'm boring you with this, but we're coming back to this painting again because it's so terrific. So this is an unusual portrait because it is a posthumous portrait. The woman that's depicted here actually died in childbirth with her second child in 1772. And this painting has been dated and signed by Charles Willson Peale in 1773. Charles Willson Peale had already returned from England at this point. He had been back in Annapolis for a year or two at this point, and he's just a couple of years before he goes to Philadelphia to be a part of the new liberty movement that's happening in Philadelphia, the independence movement. He becomes wildly successful in Philadelphia as a portrait painter of a lot of the government officials that are emerging in this new revolutionary era. But in its more humble beginnings, you can sort of see that I want to point out this painting, and I'm going to go into detail for this. Bear with me one second. Here we go. And I will try to get around this glare a little bit. I wanted you to take a quick look at Mary's face and the sort of facial work. Well, first, before I do that, I'll show you the signature. If we can get a little, I don't know if it's going to be bright enough for you to be able to see this very well, but you can just make out the signature here and the date 1773. So C. Peale. And Mary Wincoop's face. So her face is stylized according to sort of the popular aesthetics of the period of the 1750s, 1760s. And I feel like you can really see the influence of John Hesselius, the portrait painter, well-known mid-Atlantic portrait painter of the 1750s, 1760s. And the thing that I really want to point out is the sort of the rather oval shape of the head, the kind of stylized representation of the eyebrow, and then the almond-shaped eye. Now, this is an idea of this is sort of the concept of ideal beauty for British citizens here in the Americas, as well as in England, in the United Kingdom, starting in the first part of the 1700s and moving forward. And that idea of stylization, that idea of sort of this laying this concept of an ideal beauty over top of the actual appearance of this woman as she is represented in this portrait is something that is still sort of popularly held onto as an artistic concept with Charles Willson Peale in the first part of his career as a portraitist. So this still represents a very early period in Charles Willson Peale's career, this very long career. And I just wanted you to take a moment to sort of focus and sort of meditate on this very, what we call Baroque stylized styling of this particular sitter. So I will come back out of the detail mode now. And we're going to start, we're going to go into contrast with the two portraits that are here above this wonderful mantle. So hopefully the glare on this isn't too extreme. I sort of feel like when I walk in here, because we have a lot of light in this room, when I walk in here, sometimes I have to sort of move around a little bit because the paint surface of these paintings is actually pretty glossy. Which is in keeping with the period. But I'm sure you probably have pretty good depiction of what's happening here. But I wanted to now sort of contrast Mary Wincoop Ridgely's portrait with the depiction of the two figures that you see here. This is Maskell Ewing and his wife, remember it was Catherine Ewing? Excuse me, Jane Hunter Ewing. So Maskell Ewing was a lawyer in New Jersey, but his wife's family had property in sort of Delaware County, so northern Delaware, southern Pennsylvania area. And they ended up moving here. He started in pretty humble sort of origins, but then a neighbor of his, I believe it was in New Jersey, had him study law. And so now with the portrait that you see here, he has volumes of law books behind him. He has rulings that he's participated in listed here behind him, dated 1787. And he even has his own calling card, like a business card, presenting with his name, Maskell Ewing Esquire, meaning gentleman. So he's really sort of throwing it all out there. He's really sort of showing off, as is his wife. She's wearing hair pieces. The wig is totally killing it. The clothing is fantastic. You can sort of see the use of the pearls tied in around her chest. And then she's also represented fashionable furniture, fashionable architecture. She is literate, meaning that she's depicted with a book here. And she really wants you to know that she is a woman of a particular class. You know, they're both really sort of putting it out there. The great thing about this, so the contrast with the Mary Wincoop Ridgely portrait that we were taking a look at. Look how naturalistic the figures are here. Look how well, the coloration of the figures, look how naturalistically the eyes are depicted. There's a much more sort of scientific study of the details of these particular figures. And they are a little less stylishly superimposed. They're not quite as, the fashion here is much more neoclassical. It's much more interested in a, a flattering, but ultimately very accurate representation of the people that are being depicted here. And this is truly Charles Willson Peale at its best. He was bringing these very fashionable ideas from the United Kingdom, from London, to America in order to be able to depict individuals in these very sort of naturalistic, not stylized fashions of the past. This new reality, this new kind of realism in a way, although we're not really using realism in the proper sense here, it seemed to be supported by the new sobering attitude that was happening around the revolutionary period. People wanted to be accurately represented. And so what you see, so you see that basically in these depictions. What's interesting about these, well, there's lots of things that are interesting about these two paintings, but one of the things that's really fun is that these paintings actually got split up in an auction in like 1989, I think it was. Whoever, the family members that owned these, because these sold out of I believe it was sort of later members of the Ewing family. These sold in separate lots. They did not sell as a pair out of this auction. And our museum's founder, Sewell Biggs, was successful in getting the Maskell Ewing portrait. He was unsuccessful in getting the portrait of Mary Jane. Why can't I remember that? Jane Hunter Ewing. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with names today. But they were separated for well over 20, almost 30 years. And the couple that had purchased this in the Philadelphia area, they had unfortunately passed away, but their estate came to auction just a couple of years ago. We saw the work advertised and we were successfully able to bid and bring these works back together. And interestingly, she arrived on Valentine's Day about 3 years ago. So we were delighted to be able to bring them back together. And we were even further delighted to note that their original frames were still intact on both pieces. Just a really, really fun story and a terrific pair of portraits. So Charles Willson Peale, terrifically talented guy, traveled, did all these wonderful things, got some great ideas while he was in the UK, got some great connections, came back to America, started building this patron base in the year 1776 in Philadelphia, went on to be one of the first official portrait painters of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and other signers of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, he was working in very, very high circles. And in addition, he was also studying and sort of expanding his own base of interest. He became a great naturalist in the beginning of the 18th century, and was very interested in academic education for burgeoning artists within America. So much so that he went on to train his brother, James, in painting, as well as to influence the education of not only his own children, but James's children as well. So not only his sons and daughters, but his nieces and nephews also were trained to become professional painters in their own right. And there ended up becoming dozens of Peale painters throughout the end of the 1700s and throughout the entirety of the 1800s. This juggernaut of a family, they were sort of this kind of army of artists coming out of Philadelphia and then eventually Baltimore, some sort of trickle into New York. It's just this incredible legacy of sort of artistic production and artistic contributions basically to this idea of American art history coming from one family. So that by itself is kind of great, but also Charles Willson Peale was also the founder of one of America's first art museums, or one of America's first museums. he started several different museum projects and sort of moved from location to location in Philadelphia, starting in the 1780s and then going up into the first part of the 1800s. And his interest was not just the painting, although he did display a lot of his own paintings, and especially portraits of Revolutionary War heroes inside this gallery as one of the main attractions. But he was also a great ornithologist. He was collecting bird specimens. He was trading bird specimens with a similar kind of institution in the UK. And so they were trading, so he had not only American, but also British-born birds on display. He was one of the first individuals to conduct, what do they call it? Is it an archaeological dig? He found a mastodon. This is kind of crazy to be talking about this, but he financed the dig around a mastodon skeleton in the ground in upper New York State. And this mastodon, he and his son carefully put the mastodon back together in this three-dimensional model using the original bones, a process that hadn't even been really used very extensively anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world at this point. But the mastodon was also one of the centerpieces of this museum. So there was just a wide variety of his own interests, but a lot of it had to do with sort of like a better understanding, sort of expanding understanding of America and fomentation of American history. The museum was so popular that at one point it was even housed at Independence Hall, the second floor of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So, and there were a lot of visitors to this space. So not only were his works on view there, but his family's members' works were on view there. The concept of the museum eventually failed. I understand that he was not the best businessman, but portions of that collection ended up coming to a new museum concept under the Peale family in Baltimore as well. So in the 18-teens, another museum opens up in Baltimore, but with very much the same concepts. We're going to move right here into the corner here. And to give you a better idea of this sort of veneration of military leaders in this museum site is an example that was painted specifically for the Baltimore Peale Museum. And this is a portrait from 1813 to 1814 of a guy named Commodore Jacob Jones. Commodore Jones was from the Smyrna, Delaware area originally, but he was very, very helpful, very instrumental in the War of 1812. So he was, of course, like so many individuals, commemorated by the Peale family. And we're talking about hundreds of portraits between Charles Willson Peale and then several of his sons, his daughters, James Peale, hundreds of individuals of the second half of the 1700s through the 1850s, 1860s were recorded by this family. And some of these likenesses became so popular that they were even produced, as in the case here of Commodore Jones, on British ceramics that were created specifically for the American market. So think about that for a second. This is a Delaware boy, grows up, becomes a Commodore in the War of 1812. His likeness, created by Rembrandt Peale, Charles Willson Peale's, I think, second son, is so popular that prints of it are sent to England and reproduced on jugs there that were then sold back to the American market. I guess they weren't that bitter, really, but just a remarkable storyline. And at the same time, we start to see a little bit of a transition. So the 1780s, when Maskell and Jane Hunter Ewing were produced, we saw that sort of scientific observation of the way that they looked, the sort of coloration. If you got up close to those things, you'd even see veins in their hands, and beautifully depicted. But now we're seeing the work of Charles Willson Peale's son, Rembrandt Peale. And by the way, all of his kids, all of his brother James's kids were all named after famous painters in Europe through time. So there's a Michelangelo Peale, there's a Rembrandt Peale, there's a Titian Peale, it's wild stuff. Yes, and so the painting style that's being used here on Commodore Jones is much more romantic. So you're looking at a little bit, and we're going to do our close-up again here.
You have to tap the screen.
We good? So I'm going to, let's see if I can. I want you to look at the brush strokes on this particular depiction. Look how the forms that are created here are not just sort of like flatly painted, but it's almost like the brush stroke is sort of like the paint is placed down onto the surface of the painting, and then the brush is just sort of lifted, and it becomes this kind of cloudy, almost kind of evaporating paint line, like what you see in the hairline, like what you see in the depiction of the man's clothing here. There's this quick application, this very sort of dramatic application of painting. It's much more romantic, and very much keeping with this very strange sort of angle that I'm dealing with here. But it's very, the subject, the sort of romantic figure with the hair swept forward and the cloudy skies behind him.
Pause.
With the clouds behind him, he, the sort of dramatic representation of this painting, the sort of quick application of paint that you see on the surface is befitting with the sort of dramatic theme, basically, of the work here. Also, I'll have you just take a quick look, since we're talking a little bit about frames, I'll have you take a look at this, the type of frame that we're seeing here with the stars in the corner, the sort of rope detail. This is the type of frame that we commonly see on Peale portraits of this time period. Thanks, Roberta, appreciate that. And while we're at it, I'm just gonna give you a little bit of a close-up of the sort of the printed reproduction of Mr. Jones here as well. See if I can close up on that a little bit. And you can see by the angle, by the sweep of the hair, by the depiction of the clothing, it's really taken directly from the painting. It's really just, it's such a terrific sort of, it's such a terrific, I don't know, sort of like historical narrative around this image. It's in terms of sort of tracing the history and the use of this image. So Rembrandt Peale becomes co-director of the Baltimore Peale Museum, along with his brother, Rubens, who we will see in just a little while. So I'm going to come off of detail mode now. Awesome. So I'm going to move this direction here because I want to introduce you to Charles Willson Peale's brother, James Peale. James also grew up in Annapolis, also was apprenticed as a saddler, also did not want to, but followed his older brother's footsteps in painting, especially when Charles Willson Peale came back from studying for 3 years in England. He then taught his brother to become a painter as well, and gave James control over the portrait miniature trade that Charles Willson Peale had started. So miniatures were an even more popular form of portraiture than what it is that you see now, than even what you find in sort of larger scale portraits. I mean, everybody, of course, would love to have a large scale portrait, but who can afford it? You know, it's the rare few. But plenty of individuals were able to invest in portrait miniatures. They are often watercolor painted on ivory. And James Peale really excelled at this and working in very small scale. That was until about 1810, 1811, if I remember correctly, when his eyesight started to fail and he started to work more succinctly in larger scale. Now, the piece that's over my shoulder here of Margaretta and Ryan, can you all see this pretty well? Let me know if you have any difficulty seeing this particular portrait. We can do a little close up on it, but it's kind of nice to be able to see it in this sort of large scale. You're looking at an early, if not original, frame on the piece. And it's beautifully detailed sort of portrait, very fashionable woman, this beautiful fashionable lace over top of her head, sort of a veil sort of cascading over her arms, and this remarkable, probably Baltimore, maybe Philadelphia, Grecian couch that you see that she's sitting at. It's just the best. It's so, so good. This is James Peale, but this is James Peale working in a much larger scale than he's really known for. There are probably hundreds of miniatures known by James Peale, but there's only about 70 or 80 large scale portraits, and this is one of them. Yep, you're good. And it's just a wonderful sort of, it's a wonderful work of in terms of its portrait. She is at the height of fashion. So this is, 1817. We are deep into the Greek, into sort of Greek influence, or I should say sort of classical influence upon fine and decorative arts of America. And with her empire waist, the Grecian sofa that we saw earlier, the way that she's wearing her hair up, all of this sort of points to just being very, very high style. We're having some delays between the voice and the camera, so I will do these little pauses every so often to be able to catch up. I apologize for that. But we might be in a part of the museum that doesn't have the best reception, so we will soldier on, as Commodore Jones would tell us to. The other example of James Peale's works that I wanted to show you here is really one of my favorite pieces within the collection. It is the still life. And we'll even talk a little bit about this wallpaper in a second, which isn't related to the Peales, but it's kind of the elephant in the room. The still life that you see here is just fantastic. It's sort of showing all of these different varieties of fruit at their fullest. This is the moment that they have to be eaten. This is the last minute before they start to rot, as is evidenced in the sort of probably apple that you see over here in the left-hand corner. It's a type of image that was popular in the UK, was popular in continental Europe, that really just sort of reminded individuals that they really needed to get in there and enjoy life, to appreciate life as much as possible. So remarkably talented guy, working alongside his brother, and like Charles Willson Peale, has a large family, is also instrumental in training that family. And one of the things that I really love about our collection as we sort of move to the left here is that we have several examples by different women within the family as well. So the first one that I wanted to show you here is a work done by the daughter, Margaretta Angelica Peale, of Still Life in Strawberry, Still Life with Strawberries and Cherries here on the bottom. And we can get into a little detail here. We're just changing cameras in 1 second. So here we are. This is Margaretta Angelica Peale. She trained with her father. She also trained with her uncles. So these would be the children of Charles Willson Peale. Charles Willson Peale being her, well, I guess she would have trained with her older cousins because Charles Willson Peale was her uncle. Rather an accomplished painter, but really known more for her still life than anything. She was also if I remember, she was one of the early members of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Now, this is a school for art instruction that was established in Philadelphia, in part by Charles Willson Peale and some other contemporaries like, well, the name is escaping me right now. But even in this very early period, so in the very first part of the 1800s, 1812, 1817, I forget when it was, she was already actively involved in art instruction at the Pennsylvania Academy. Now, while we are in detail mode, I'm going to move up and I'm going to show you a painting, another still life by a woman named Mary Jane Peale. This would have been the second cousin, I guess, to Margaret and Angelica Peale. Mary Jane Peale was the daughter of Rubens Peale. Rubens Peale was one of the sons of Charles Willson Peale. So Charles Willson Peale was this woman's grandfather. She was born in about 1827. And just to put this in context, the painting that we just saw a second ago, Margaret Angelica Peale, daughter of James Peale, was born in 1795. So there's like a 30-year difference between these two folks. We can talk a little bit about how things have changed stylistically from James Peale, very sort of accurate representation, almost scientific representation of the fruit, to Margaret Angelica Peale has kind of a flatter approach to painting that really sort of emphasizes a lot of color. And here with Mary Jane Peale's painting of about, well, this is later, so this is like the 1890s. She is really talking more about the way that you're placing paint on the surface. It has less to do about the subjects and this very gentle, very sort of this very sort of studied idea of transition of color, the sort of blending of colors across the surface, which is really, really kind of remarkable. The figures themselves, like the fruit that's here, is almost kind of abstracted, and really it's almost sort of a play on, it's almost sort of a study of colors more so than anything. Now, Mary Jane Peale, like her second cousin, Margaret Angelica Peale, were notable artists of their time. They probably at times even sort of supported themselves. I don't believe that either of the women, and very few of the women in the Peale family ever really married. Well, maybe half of them or so did, but I'm not sure that either of these two women did. But the thing that I want you to note about Mary Jane Peale is that she is considered to be the person who trained her father, Rubens Peale, to become a painter. And we will come back out of detail so that we can do a little bit of side-by-side here. One second. See, I take direction very well. This is Rubens Peale. So, okay, Rubens Peale is one of the younger brothers of Charles Willson Peale's first wife. She died, but and he ended up marrying 3 times. But Rubens Peale, I believe, was part of the first group of kids that were created. And I mean, there were 6 from the first marriage that survived, and like another 5 from the second. There were so many kids, it's just unbelievable. But Rubens Peale, he did not show an early interest in painting. He probably received some art instruction early on, but he did not do a lot of painting as a younger individual. But he did go on to become co-director, along with his brother, of the Baltimore Peale Museum. So he was part of the family business for sure. It wasn't until later that, and I want to say it was even after the Baltimore Museum had been closed and its contents had been distributed, had been dispersed, had been sold off, Rubens Peale at that point started to do painting. Now, he is known to have trained with Edward Moran, one of the brother of the very, so he's a landscape painter, marine painter that stayed on the East Coast while his brother, Thomas Moran, went west in the second half of the 1800s to paint places like Grand Canyon and God only knows what else. But Edward Moran was an early influence upon Rubens Peale. And we might see some of that in the evocation of the landscape that you see here. Now, the landscape that's here in this painting is probably not any sort of real true identifiable place, but it seems to be very heavily influenced by the Hudson Valley, as were a lot of landscape painting that was coming up in the period just before and just after the Civil War. This painting that you see here, and again, I want you to just sort of do a little mental comparison between the daughter's work, Mary Jane Peale, and the work of her father, who she supposedly influenced to paint, that she taught to paint. I just love that story. I just learned it today getting prepared for this, for today's talk. And the painting that you see here, this is one of a type of painting that Rubens Peale did quite a bit in the last years of his life, in like the last maybe 15 years of his life, called Happy Family painting. So you can see the Quayle family of the sort of patriarchal figure, the matriarchal figure, and then all of these children around it. He was certainly not the sort of inventor of this concept of the sort of happy family, but he was definitely in the sort of the group of these early Victorian Americans that were thinking about prosperity and the sort of how do you say this, the sort of adoration of the nuclear family here in America, and how it becomes sort of a reflection of the strength of the nation. So Rubens Peale. Coincidentally, this is one of the last pieces that was ever brought into the collection by the museum's founder, Sewell Biggs. And well, we were very delighted to have it, but I think he paid a lot for it. What time do we have here? To be mindful of time and wanting to make sure that we have enough time for some question and answers, I'm just going to sort of have you focus for a second on this great wallpaper and sort of taking the room for a second before we go into our last painting. Like I said, this is a room specifically for Federal period. Now, we made the concession to have so much of the Peale collection here on view in this room, but the emphasis of this room in terms of the timeline has to do with this Federal period furniture. So you're looking at, 1770s up, really emphasizing 1780s, 1790s, and then up until about 1800 in here, maybe even a few years into the 1800s. One of the things that we did in these galleries was to bring in a new interpretive layer for this space. And we've done this with many of our period galleries, where we create an emphasis wall using reproduction wallpapers. So the wallpaper that you see here, I know you probably have noticed it, it's hard to miss. This was actually, this wallpaper in the scale and the colors that you see right now were being produced in Philadelphia at the time of the American Revolution. And it's just fantastic stuff with these bright orange colors. They're just terrific, really, really terrific stuff. And the subject matter, the subjects that you see depicted here is an allegorical figure of America with her tobacco crown, pointing to a representation of British law and casting aside British control, represented by the seated figure to the left. So America has adapted its origins for its own uses, but without the control of its colonial power, or of the colonial power that had established it. So quite a little story, quite a little narrative there, quite a revolutionary kind of subject, but really, really fun thing. Can you imagine an entire room of this? It was hard enough for us to imagine one wall, but I'm delighted that it's here because it's super fun. And people always ask. The furniture that you see here underneath, the majority of this is, if you can see probably some of the tops of it, without necessarily having to sort of labor the subject, these are all sort of Federal period furniture that was made in Dover, a couple of Newcastle counties, a few things from Smyrna, and chairs from Philadelphia. So we're really looking at this really great sort of 1780s, 1790s Mid-Atlantic examination. So with that, I'm going to show you our last image here. This is a portrait by a guy named James Peale Polk. So this is the nephew of Charles Willson Peale. This is the son of his younger sister, if I remember correctly. When this painter was only perhaps like 9 or 10 years old, his parents died, he was an orphan, and then he was basically adopted by Charles Willson Peale, moved to Philadelphia and trained right alongside all the rest of the kids to become a painter in his own right. And he painted off and on for years, really. He only lived to be about 55, but there are a considerable number of these works around. This is a guy named Charles Nixon, an ancestor of President Nixon, and an individual who lived here in Dover, and actually ran a salacious relationship with an area woman, but who he eventually moved in with and made an honest woman of her. But just about that same time, he had this really glorious portrait done with his silk jacket and his very fashionable sort of button sewn into the surface. It's really, really terrific story. One thing that I want to bring up, and I probably should have brought it up before the tour started, but it'll give you another reason to come and experience the rest of the Peale collection, but also to get a glimpse of this new acquisition. For a little while longer, we will have on view a pair of silhouettes that were created in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Peale Museum in the first part of the 1800s. And they were stamped Peale Museum on the surface of the paper. And silhouettes, they're sort of cut paper silhouettes. The figures are usually only a couple of inches tall. There's usually a black cloth or paper as a background, but it's a perfect likeness of the silhouette in profile of the sitter. In this case, it is a man and a woman. The man is a famous silversmith from Wilmington, and it's his wife. So the two of them are in a frame together, and this was a gift to the museum. The interesting thing here is that at this time, at the Peale Museum, the silhouettes were all created by Charles Willson Peale's enslaved worker, a man named Moses, if I remember correctly. And Moses had been trained to create silhouettes by a piece of equipment that Charles Willson Peale was distributing really to area artists. So it was interesting that there would then be this demonstration of this object, of this device, this tool there in the museum. But these silhouettes, there are lots of Peale Museum silhouettes, and a lot of them were done by this enslaved figure. And it's really terrific that we were gifted an example that we would also be able to have on display here within the museum. So with that, that is, it's a kind of a quick snapshot of at least a good portion, but not the entirety of the Peale collection here at the museum. And I encourage you to start asking questions if you need, if you would like. So now the Peale collection that we have here, this is the most extensive collection that we have of any one particular family of painters within the area. But we have here at the museum a lot of paintings of Peale family member contemporaries. So a lot of works from Delaware as well as Philadelphia from all of these time frames, these 1770s up past the Civil War. And then of course we go on beyond that as well. But we're actively collecting, mostly by gifts, but also some purchases of works by this time, from this time period.
Hi, Ryan. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of portraiture during this period?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And that's a great question, because we look at a lot of portraits today and we're like, yeah, so what, it's portraits. But in America, as it was true pretty much of the rest of the British world, portraits were the first real the very first sort of important type of painting that was being conducted in America. And think about it, portraits usually sort of commemorate great moments in a person's life. It might commemorate a wedding or the birth of a child, the beginning of a family, perhaps some terrific trip that a person takes, building your own first house, something along those lines is being commemorated with most portraits. And so if you, before photography, and before you really have easy access to a lot of easy ways to represent yourself, you're probably not going to hire somebody for the really expensive process of like recording an image of your house, or the landscape out your window, or some fanciful place that you find in upstate New York, or something along those lines. You're going to make an image of yourself, whether it's a silhouette, or whether it's a miniature, or whether it's a short portrait like what you see here, the head and bust, or even a full-length portrait like you see in some examples. This is what you're going to invest in first. This is how you're going to commemorate yourself. This is how you're going to commemorate your parents. This is how you're going to commemorate the wife you just lost in childbirth. This is what you're going to invest your time and money into. So for a very long time, and well into the 1800s, portraits was king. Little by little, as the economy here in the United States begins to grow, as there is a growing middle class and upper class of individuals, you start to see them, as we saw here in the galleries that I just showed you, you start to see more emphasis on still life paintings, and you get more emphasis on American landscapes. And those become increasingly more important, as well as sort of history paintings, genre imagery, and a lot of other sort of subjects as well. Those become increasingly more important across the 1800s and of course into the 20th century.
Hi, Ryan. We have another question coming in. Can you repeat the name of the nephew?
James Peale Polk, P-O-L-K. Not quite as well known as a lot of his cousins, especially the sons of Charles Willson Peale, who are almost as popularly known as Charles Willson Peale as himself. Probably not as well known as James Peale, the brother, but a very talented individual, and an individual with a little bit different scope. He moved to areas where the other members of the Peale family did not live. Well, I think that looks like that's the end of our questions so far. So I'm just going to wrap things up here unless anybody has any other questions. But thank you so much for being a part of the show tonight. I hope you learned something. I certainly did, because I had to sort of warm up and sort of recatch some of this information. But what a terrific, terrific collection that's here. If you like what's happening here with the Peale collection, if you want to learn more about them, there are terrific examples of Peale family works at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. That's really sort of the mothership of all things related to Peale. I would definitely recommend going to take a look at that collection, or collections, because there's so many examples of them. But there are a lot of works out there. They were a very prolific family, and you will be able to find works of them at most major museums in America. Thanks, everybody. Come back again.